The click of my heels echoed in the hallway as a reminder that I was alive. After so many years of struggling to earn respect, there I was, on the verge of advancement, surrounded by people pretending to smile but hoping to see me fall. The coffee in my hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from foreboding. It was strange. Something in the air warned that this beautiful day would have a bitter aftertaste. I thought the worst was over, that the long nights of hard work, the courses I paid for with sacrifice, the sidelong glances, and the whispers behind my back were behind me. After all, for a black woman in her late 60s to rise to the leadership position of a large company was no small feat. It was a milestone. Victory, or so it seemed. But there are some things that success can't hide. How smiles fade when you walk into a room. How conversations change subject when your voice starts to stand out. It's a loneliness that only those who have gone too far can recognize. And that day, that loneliness accompanied me like an ancient perfume. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. The hours passed with the weight of a promise. I could barely comprehend time, trapped between spreadsheets, meetings, and doubtful glances. Until a simple gesture changed everything. An envelope, a joke spoken aloud, a stifled laugh that ran through the room like an electric current. And suddenly, everything I had built began to crumble. Not because of my own mistake, but because of cruelty disguised as mischief. Humiliation has sound, smell, and color. Mine came in shades of white and beige, mixed with the smell of burnt coffee from the cafeteria and the squeak of chairs being pushed back. I heard my name being called as if it were a joke. I felt eyes piercing my skin like razors. I saw colleagues who had once asked me for advice pretend not to see me. The floor didn't open, but something inside me sank, and the fall was silent. It's funny how the workplace can become the stage for a cruel spectacle. You think you're part of the team, but you discover you were just a character, a convenient example for diversity campaigns. Company pride, until your competition threatens the egos of those who believe that power comes from race, age, and surname. I still remember the sound of laughter, that muffled laugh that floats in the air, as if ashamed to exist. It was then that I realized that the humiliation didn't come just from the words, but from the silence of those watching. No one said anything. And that silence was more violent than any insult. The question that kept coming back to me was simple. Why does it still hurt so much when people pretend you don't belong in the place you built? I'd endured disdainful looks in lines, distrust in stores, prejudice disguised as kindness. But here, inside the office I'd helped build with years of work, the wound felt deeper, as if it had been dug slowly and carefully. At that moment, I understood that true power lies not in those who shout the loudest, but in those who silently observe. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I just watched. And anyone who knows me knows. When I remain silent, it's because I've already begun to act. They didn't know that this humiliation, this cruel and seemingly banal scene, would be the beginning of something much bigger. Because when respect is stripped from you, what remains is courage. And that's precisely what began to grow in me. A cold, meticulous courage, with a touch of justice. Fate has a funny way of turning the tables. And sometimes, what seems like defeat is just the first step toward an unexpected revelation. After all, how long can a wounded heart remain still before deciding it's time to return every look, every word, every laugh? That afternoon, the clock seemed to mock me. The hands ticked with cruel slowness, and every passing second seemed as if the sound of laughter still echoed, trapped in the ceiling of the conference room. I tried to maintain my posture, my shoulders firm, my face serene, but inside, I felt as if something was silently breaking. Those who observe from the outside don't see the exact moment when trust shatters. But I felt it. It was a snap, an invisible rupture, like the sound of a string snapping inside my chest. Playful words mingled with looks I knew well, the kind that feign innocence but hide pleasure at seeing someone uncomfortable. The worst part wasn't what they said, but what they didn't. The way they all just stood there, pretending nothing had happened. Pretending the humiliation was tame, that the embarrassment was a figment of my imagination. But it wasn't. I could feel the embarrassment forming in the air, like a thick cloud that refused to dissipate. Silence is a dangerous weapon. It accumulates in the corners of the room, between the computer keys, among the coffee cups forgotten in the pantry. And it was in that silence that I realized that environment had never been mine. I was tolerated, I never belonged. A symbol, a convenient showcase, used to fill reports and speeches about inclusion. And when I stopped being convenient, I became a target. That night, I rode home on a crowded bus, staring out the window at the reflection of my face merging with the city lights. The cold of the glass against my forehead comforted me more than any words spoken in that office. I thought about everything I'd had to swallow to get there. The times they called me strong when they really wanted to suffer in silence. The jokes about my hair, the condescending smiles when I spoke firmly. I thought about how a black woman's life is made up of small wars fought in spaces where mistakes are never allowed, but disrespect is routine. But even so, I didn't cry. There was something inside me that wouldn't bend. An old voice, perhaps the same one my mother carried when she said, "Dignity isn't asked for, it's imposed." I knew I couldn't face those people with anger, because anger is what they expect. What disarms them is serenity. It's looking those who belittle you in the eye and holding your head high, as if saying wordlessly, "You didn't break me." As the bus moved forward, I observed the people around me. Tired faces, lost gazes, silent stories like mine. It was there, among strangers, that I realized my pain wasn't just mine. It was collective. It was part of an ancestral fatigue, inherited from generations who learned to endure it with a smile. And perhaps that's why I couldn't give up. Because when one of us falls, the whole ground shakes. In the days that followed, my body went to work, but my soul didn't. I observed more than I spoke. And the more I observed, the more I saw the web of deception that sustained that company. Empty praise, meaningless meetings, insecure bosses who hid their incompetence behind expensive suits. Realizing this brought me a strange peace. It was as if, at last, I saw the whole picture, not just the role they expected me to play. It was in this state of apparent calm that I began to plan, even though I didn't yet know what I would do. I wrote, memorized, and connected the dots. Not with immediate vengeance, but with precision. Because I learned that the truth, when it comes, doesn't need to be shouted, simply needs to be revealed. And it's funny how, when we stop reacting, the world begins to reveal itself. People who once seemed untouchable began to stumble upon their own lies. Documents forgotten in the wrong folders, messages that shouldn't exist, whispered conversations in the hallways. It was as if fate itself was handing me the puzzle pieces. Meanwhile, I stood there serene. Every glance I made was interpreted as a surrender, but it was actually a strategy. Because there is immense power in the silence of the observer. And that's precisely why so many people choose to stay here after each revelation. Because they know that sometimes it's in silence that justice begins to flourish. What no one knew was that I had already found something. A small, discreet, but devastating piece of evidence. And I kept it with me, waiting for the right moment. Because in the end, time is the best ally of those who have learned to endure. And my time was about to come. For days, the office atmosphere seemed to breathe with me. Heavy, dense, as if it knew something was about to happen. The laughter that had once echoed around the desks was now more subdued. I started quickly. It was as if the air had learned to keep secrets. I walked through the halls, feeling the sound of my own footsteps reverberate off the walls, my firm heels setting the rhythm of a quietly growing tension. The evidence I found was small, almost insignificant to someone who didn't know what to look for. A forgotten email, a badly deleted message, an exchange of confidences between two colleagues who thought they were invisible. But in that small detail lay the truth. Clear, cold, and cruel. I'd been used as a scapegoat to cover up a serious mistake, something that could tarnish the company's image. And for that, they needed someone easy to blame. That's when I understood. It wasn't just about racism or envy. It was about power. About who has the right to make mistakes and who needs to be perfect to be tolerated. I, with years of experience under my belt, would be the convenient face of the scandal. A black woman in her late 60s served as the villain when the system needed a body to sacrifice. The nights became too long. I returned home exhausted, but with my mind awake. The ticking of the wall clock accompanied me like a cruel reminder that time passed and the truth still slept, hidden inside me. Sometimes I would get up in the middle of the night, turn on the dim kitchen light, and open my laptop. I relived every detail, every email exchange, every suspicious sentence. And the more I read, the more my blood ran cold. The lie was so well woven that it seemed real, but all it took was a tug of a thread for everything to begin to unravel. Sometimes fear would overcome me. What if they found out I knew? What if they tried to silence me somehow? The fear smelled. The same burnt paper that emanated from the printer as I passed the principal's office. The same smell of cheap perfume mixed with cold coffee, reminding me of the day of my humiliation. It was as if the entire environment conspired to test me, provoke me, push me to my limits. But there was also a thread of hope. Fragile, subtle, but real. With each new piece of evidence, with each small detail that confirmed what I already sensed, this thread grew stronger, and I clung to it like someone clinging to a twig in a storm. Because the truth, when it emerges, has its own strength. The contrast between what I showed and what I felt was a silent spectacle. On the outside, I was calm, polite, and punctual. Inside, I felt an electric shock every time I crossed paths with one of those responsible. When they looked at me, they saw the peaceful woman I had always been. What they didn't know was that behind that smile, a plan was being hatched with the precision of a surgeon. Their expressions began to change. So did the tone of their conversations. Their discomfort was palpable, as if they sensed something was slipping out of their grasp. I watched. Every word, every glance, every pause. The truth has a curious way of insinuating itself. It begins as a whisper and ends as an unstoppable scream. And I was ready to listen to every whisper until the sound became impossible to ignore. The weight of injustice began to transform my body. Exhaustion mingled with a new, almost feverish energy. It was as if the pain had become fuel. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt empowered. The power to observe, to understand, to choose the right moment. The fear that had once paralyzed me now guided me, like an inverted compass pointing to the exact spot where everything would collapse. One night, as I turned off the lights in my office, I saw my reflection in the window. The dark glass revealed a woman who was no longer the same. Her eyes reflected something different. A mixture of serenity and suppressed fury. I stared at myself for long seconds and realized the game had changed. It was no longer about clearing my name. It was about proving how much they had underestimated someone who had learned to survive in silence. And it was there, with that reflection, that an idea began to take shape. A subtle, simple, almost invisible plan, like everything truly dangerous. The kind of plan that doesn't require shouting, just time. I took a deep breath, turned off the light, and let the darkness envelop me. Because sometimes, it's in the darkness that justice begins to see. In the following days, I learned to hide the fire burning inside me. I greeted people with a contained smile, sipped my coffee as calmly as ever, answered calls and attended meetings, while inside, every gesture was a silent preparation. The world around me seemed oblivious to the change. And perhaps that was my greatest advantage. The invisibility that had previously harmed me now became my ally. I began to observe more closely. The expressions of discomfort when I entered the room. The whispers interrupted mid-sentence. The sentences that vanished into thin air. It was as if my mere presence created an uncomfortable mirror. I saw the fear in their eyes. Not fear of what I might do, but of what I already knew. Power sometimes lies precisely in this. In letting the other person imagine how much you've discovered. But what surprised me most was realizing that, even in the face of injustice, my heart wasn't filled with hatred. What I felt was something deeper. A kind of serene sadness, like someone who finally understands that some wounds don't come to destroy, but to reveal who we truly are. And this understanding began to strengthen me. I was no longer the woman seeking to prove her worth. I was the woman who had discovered her own worth, even when they tried to erase it. One rainy morning, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and let the sound of the rain fill the silence of the house. The drops hit the glass slowly, as if time itself were asking me to breathe. I closed my eyes and imagined each step of my plan. The words you would say, the precise moment, the exact place where the truth would be revealed. The calm I felt in that moment surprised me. It was as if fear had finally switched sides. There is a special strength in those who learn to wait. The silence that was once synonymous with submission was now my strategy. Every minute I remained silent was a rope they themselves were pulling. And it was then that I understood something that affected me deeply. Justice, when it comes, needs no spectacle. It prevails with the elegance of an indisputable truth. At work, I began to notice small cracks between them. There were hushed arguments, suspicious glances, and last-minute meetings cancelled. The atmosphere was different. What had once been a certainty began to turn into doubt. And nothing frightens those who live by appearances more than the rumor of a revelation. One of those mornings, I ran into one of the directors in the hallway. He tried to avoid me but ended up crossing my path. His smile was strained, his gaze fleeting. I simply greeted him calmly and moved on. No words were necessary. My silence spoke volumes. And it's at this point that many feel the need to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message has moved them. Because we've all felt, at some point, the weight of accepting something we didn't deserve. The nights were long again, but in a different way. There was no more anxiety, only a quiet anticipation. I organized documents, reviewed evidence, and recalled every conversation with precision. Everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle I never asked to be put together, but which now belonged to me. And the more I understood the magnitude of what they had done, the clearer it became that the truth must come out, not for revenge, but for justice. Still, there was something that troubled me. The memory of who I was before all this. The woman who believed that being good was enough to be respected. Who was dedicated, who believed in rules, who trusted flattery. That woman still lived inside me, trying to understand when the world stopped being fair. Sometimes I wanted to hug her, to tell her that she wasn't wrong for believing. That it wasn't her fault for expecting reciprocity. The contrast between these two versions of myself was painful, but also liberating. I no longer had to choose between being kind or strong. I discovered I could be both at once. That kindness didn't negate bravery. That patience could be a form of resilience. And somehow this gave me more power than any position or recognition. I knew the moment of truth was approaching. I sensed it in the details. In the thick air of the office, in the restlessness of those who had avoided me for weeks, in the way they whispered my name again in the hallways. It was the kind of premonition that precedes a storm. You feel it even before you hear the thunder. And while everything around me seemed to be preparing for the inevitable, something new was born within me. A feeling that blended calm and strength, as if the universe itself were breathing with me, waiting for the precise moment to reveal what had always been hidden. Because every truth, no matter how silent it may seem, has its opportune moment to be spoken. And mine was approaching. What tormented me most wasn't the memory of the humiliation, but the silence that followed. It had a sound of its own. The sound of footsteps evading each other, of doors slowly closing, of voices whispering names without the courage to speak the truth. It was a heavy, dense, almost palpable silence. I felt it spread throughout the company, filling the aisles, the tables, and everyone's gaze. And in the midst of it, I stood there, steadfast, almost invisible, but with my eyes wide open so that I wouldn't be ignored. There was something paradoxical about that weight. On the one hand, fear, the uncertainty of what was to come, of the weight that would still weigh me down. On the other, hope, the feeling that, even amidst injustice, I was becoming something greater. It was like walking on a glass floor. Every step had to be calculated, every movement measured, but there was also clarity, transparency, the promise of seeing everything clearly at the end of the journey. Over the next few mornings, I began to notice the details. The sound of the elevator arriving, the clicking of pens, the controlled tone of the conversation. Everything seemed normal, but there was a different atmosphere. a tension seeping into their gestures. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't yet know what. This uncertainty was the first sign that they were no longer in control. I didn't need to do anything. I simply had to exist. Sometimes revenge begins exactly like that. When you learn to occupy the space they tried to deny you. When your mere presence becomes uncomfortable for those who once treated you as disposable. And that's what I realized. Their discomfort was proof that I was no longer a prisoner of fear. But there were times when I felt great regret. Remembering the small displays of affection that once existed, the smiles that seemed genuine, the trivial conversations on the weekend. It was strange to realize that betrayal also arises from living together, that you have to be so close to hurt so deeply. And yet, that memory didn't make me back down. It reminded me why I needed to persevere. At home, the nights were long and silent. I left the light on in the living room and watched the shadows move across the walls, as if the house breathed with me. The notebook where I had jotted down every detail of the floor plan lay on the table. The pages were yellowed with time, the ink almost faded, but the contents were alive, throbbing. Names, dates, connections. Everything was there, meticulously recorded. Sometimes I ran my fingers over the written lines, as if touching a scar, remembering that each word represented a wound, but also a strength. With each passing day, the line between fear and courage grew thinner. I no longer knew when I was shaking from nervousness and when from determination. It was a dangerous mix, but also liberating. Because deep down I already knew. The worst was over. What would come now wouldn't be suffering but consequences. I remember one sunset in particular. The sky was tinged with red. The air was damp after the rain. And I was standing by the office window, watching the drops slide down the glass. There was something symbolic about that scene. The purification that comes after the storm, the moment when the world seems suspended between chaos and calm. And that was when I understood that the truth is also like that. It begins as destruction but ends as purification. Something stirred inside me. A kind of silent force that no longer sought pure revenge, but justice with dignity. I didn't just want to see the guilty parties fall. I wanted them to understand the weight of what they had done. To feel the shame in the eyes of those they once admired. To understand that humiliation comes at a price. And that price was about to be exacted. Sometimes I caught myself imagining the future. What the moment of revelation would be like, everyone's reaction, the murmur that would spread through the halls. There was a strange beauty in this image. It wasn't the pleasure of watching them suffer, but the sense of balance being restored. As if the universe, after so much time, had decided to settle accounts. And yet, something told me it wouldn't be easy. That before his fall, I would have to face something inside me. The old fear, the weight of mistrust, the guilt of having believed too much. Because sometimes, true liberation isn't in exposing the other, but in not allowing what they did to continue to define you. Night fell slowly, and the distant sounds of the city reminded me that the world moved on, oblivious to what was about to happen. But inside, everything was speeding up. It was as if an electric current ran through my body, anticipating the inevitable. What had remained hidden for so long would finally find its way out. And it was there, amidst the silence and the sound of bated breath, that I understood. The hour was approaching. I felt it in the air, in the vibrant lights, in the murmur of the walls. The moment to reveal everything was about to dawn, and when it arrived, nothing, absolutely nothing, could hold it back. That week, time seemed endless. The hours at the office ticked by slowly, the clock ticking at an almost cruel pace. Every second was a reminder that the secret I was keeping was pulsing, ready to break the silence. The atmosphere had changed, not just for me but for everyone. It was as if an invisible shadow hung over every conversation, every meeting. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed that something was about to change. I looked around and saw anxious faces, restrained gestures, rehearsed smiles. Those same people who had avoided me now didn't know how to act. Some tried to be overly friendly, others pretended not to see me. Hypocrisy smelled, the same scent of overly sweet perfume, trying to mask the odor of guilt. It was almost poetic to witness that silent reversal. The ignored, disbelieving woman was now the center of the general malaise. But inside, the contrast was different. I teetered between calm and storm. There were moments when everything seemed under control, and others when my heart raced just thinking about what was to come. With every step, with every glance, I felt the tension growing like a slowly tugged string. Fear and anger danced together, each trying to devour the other, and I teetered between them like someone crossing a narrow bridge over an abyss. At home, the lamp's reflection on the wall cast my shadow in an elongated and distorted way. It was curious how that image seemed to represent exactly what I felt. I was there, whole, but there were parts of me that no longer fit the same shape. The woman who suffered the humiliation no longer existed in the same way. The pain had shaped another version, more attentive, more assertive, less willing to give in. I remember one night in particular. I sat up in bed and rested my hands on the cool sheets. The silence was so intense that I could hear the distant sounds of the city, mingling with the rhythmic beat of my heart. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what would happen next. Would the truth bring relief? Or would it only open new wounds? It was a doubt that followed me like a faithful shadow. The idea of justice was comforting but also terrifying, because when lies are exposed, the entire world must reposition itself in response. In the days that followed, I began to realize that the change was already happening, even before any revelation. The way people looked at me was no longer the same. There was respect, yes, but also a kind of uncomfortable, almost fearful curiosity. As if I had crossed an invisible border and now inhabited territory where few would dare to tread. It was strange, but, in a way, liberating. The mornings were the hardest. The sun streamed in through the pantry window and illuminated the floor unevenly, creating areas of light and shadow. I often observed this contrast for a few seconds before leaving the house. It was as if the universe itself were trying to remind me that truth is also made of this, of light and dark parts, and that balance is only possible when we accept both. Some memories returned without warning. The laughter at my expense, the disdainful glances, the sound of words spoken in mocking tones. They were small sparks of memory that, instead of hurting me, now served as fuel. With each memory, I felt my purpose reaffirmed. I wasn't about to destroy anyone. I was about to restore order. Sometimes fear still visited me. It came gently, camouflaged, like the wind blowing through a half-open window. I felt it sweep through my body, trying to make me doubt, convince me to give up. But one look at my hands, at the marks of time, at the veins that told the story of a lifetime of effort, was enough to make my courage beat again. It was no longer possible to retreat. Silence, however comfortable it seemed, was no longer a refuge. It was a prison. I found myself observing the world through different eyes. People running through the streets, couples chatting in cafes, distracted smiles in bus windows. Everything seemed so distant yet so human. I realized that, in some ways, the injustice I suffered was a reflection of something larger. A mechanism that tries to silence those who are different, those who don't fit in. And, for a moment, I felt compassion even for those who had hurt me. Because only those who live by appearances can be so afraid of the truth. Time kept dragging on, but the end was approaching. I could feel it. The tension wasn't just inside me anymore. It was everywhere. In the ringing of the phone, in the breaths of people passing by, in the pause before each conversation. It was as if everyone was on the brink of something indescribable. And in that silent wait, I realized something even deeper. What I was about to reveal wasn't just a company secret. It was living proof that silence also has its limits. That dignity, taken to the extreme, finds a way to speak, even if it means breaking the air with a single gesture. The air seemed thicker that night. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the weight of what was to come. My breathing came in shallow, contained gasps, as if the universe itself were holding its breath with me. Something big was about to happen. And in that moment, suspended between fear and bravery, I knew. There was no turning back. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm clock rang. The light, still faint, filtered through the gaps in the curtains and left trails of light on the floor, as if someone had traced paths on the tiles. I stared at those lines for a while, trying to understand which one I was stepping on. My body craved permanence, my soul craved movement. It was strange to exist between these two desires. I got up slowly, feeling the weight of the sheet sliding down my legs, the rough carpet beneath my feet. I made coffee like someone performing a ritual. The aroma rose gently, invading the house, and for a moment I remembered my mother's kitchen. A cast iron pot, a low radio, a firm voice. Dignity simmering. On my way to work, the bus seemed noisier than usual. Children were laughing in the back. A boy was dozing against the window. A woman was holding a bag of vegetables with the delicacy of someone protecting something exceptional. I looked at my reflection in the glass and saw two versions of myself superimposed. The one who still bore the wound and the one who was already walking with the scar. The two were breathing together, out of sync. The city passed by outside with its gray buildings and graffiti-covered walls, and I had the feeling we were all trying to stand amidst something that had already changed. At the office, the white ceiling light made everything seem more severe. The sound of keys, the printer, the phone ringing on the desk next to me. Every sound seemed to accentuate sentences no one dared say. There was a colleague who always commented on my hair in that complimentary tone that almost sounded like a question. "How do you get it so voluminous?" I smiled briefly. This wasn't the day to point out the obvious. I was no longer willing to translate my existence into subtleties. Maturity has a way of hardening the surface but keeping the heart warm. I was exactly that. Firm skin, fiery heart, controlled. I spent the morning immersed in reports. Spreadsheets became a refuge. Numbers don't disguise intentions, they don't repeat jokes, they don't feign generosity. They are direct, and it was between columns and graphs that I found myself remembering how I got there. How I learned to hold my voice when the meeting grew cold. How I crossed my arms over my chest to prevent anyone from mistaking firmness for aggression. How I took a deep breath when a colleague asked me to smile before a client arrived. I tried to listen to my own breathing above it all and found a constant, persistent sound. It was still inside me. At lunchtime I went down to the street. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the trees on the sidewalk swayed in silent conversation. I sat on a bench and mentally reviewed what I had ready. Dates, emails, the correct names, the exact times. I knew that with just one slap, everything would crumble. But I also knew that, at the same time, the dust of what remained would fall on me. Gains and losses dancing together. Justice and exhaustion hand in hand. I returned to the desk and found an unsigned note. "We need to talk about the presentation." I read it twice. It was too neutral to be just work, too bland to hide the tension. I didn't tremble. Instead, I opened the file I'd been painstakingly preparing. In it, the data spoke for me. The trend lines outlined the truth they'd tried to pin on me as a flaw. I chose a discreet font, a restrained palette. Nothing garish. The revelation lies in the contrast. The light that gradually enters until no one can fake a shadow. In the afternoon, people moved too quickly, as if trying to beat the clock. The director crossed the hall and looked the other way. Another manager, the one who had made the joke on the day of the injury, called me honey, with a warmth that hurt more than mockery. It's funny how, when the end approaches, the world decides to whisper pleas for a truce. There was no truce. There were suits. And I leaned against them like someone leaning their back against a 100-year-old tree. Every now and then, a subtle fear crept through me, like a cold breeze between the cracks. What if, in the moment of change, they tried to silence me? What if the weight of my name, my skin, my age, turned against me like an old weapon pulled from the closet? I breathed from my belly, as I had learned when life forced me to be my own anchor. I had weathered bigger storms. This was just the most recent. The difference was that now I wasn't blindfolded. Before leaving, I stopped by the bathroom and washed my face. The cold water traced a map on my skin. I looked in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a living archive of decisions. I saw my daughter's face as a toddler, wondering why I'd come back so late. I saw my mother's hands teaching me that Respect isn't a gift, it's a limit. And I saw the woman I'd become, with time etched in my wrinkles and delicacy hidden in the corners of my eyes. I smiled toothlessly, only out of the corner of my eye that smile that says, I know. As I stepped outside, the sky had finally released the rain it had promised early on. The asphalt reflected the buildings like a dark lake, and each headlight looked like a shooting star. I pulled my coat tighter and moved on. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A short, direct message. General meeting tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Mandatory attendance. My heart pounded. Then it found its rhythm. At home, I left my umbrella open in a corner to dry. The living room light was yellow and cozy. I put on an old song, one of those that reminds me of the smell of a clean house. I sat down in front of my notebook and, in firm handwriting, wrote what I needed to remember for the next day. Speak softly. Show your strength. Look me in the eyes. I closed the cover and placed my hands on it as if sealing a pact. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the darkness, listening to the rain slow to a faint splash. Silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't silence that silenced me. It was the silence that precedes the first chord. I took a deep breath. The night seemed to hang by a thread. And for the first time in a long time, I wished dawn would pass quickly. Not escape, but arrive. The rest, I knew, was just a stone's throw away. The next morning arrived with an almost cruel precision. The air seemed thicker, as if even the wind knew something was about to happen. The city was still waking up, but inside, everything had been awake for a long time. I dressed calmly, unhurriedly, each gesture calculated like the move of a chess piece. The mirror reflected a strange serenity. It wasn't peace, it was readiness. As I entered the office, the hallway seemed longer than ever. The overhead lights cast dim shadows on the walls, and the sound of footsteps echoed like a warning. There was a quiet murmur, a pent-up anticipation that hung in the air. Everyone knew about the scheduled meeting, but no one knew what would be said. And that was exactly how I wanted it. For the first time, I was in control. I sat at my desk and opened the leather binder where I kept my documents. Each page represented not just evidence, but a reminder of what I had silently endured. The dates, the emails, the signatures, everything was there. Simple, direct, impossible to deny. It was curious to think that the same calm that guided me now was the same one they had mistaken for weakness. It was in this deception that I forged my strength. While I waited for the appointed time, I stared at the reflection in the window. Outside, the sky was divided between gray clouds and flashes of light. That duality seemed to convey what I felt, a mixture of fear and liberation, of loss and victory. I knew that if I opened my mouth, nothing would ever be the same. There would be consequences for them and for me as well. But there are times in life when the truth weighs less than silence. The minutes ticked by slowly until the secretary's voice echoed down the hallway, calling everyone to the main room. I stood up slowly, grabbed my briefcase, and walked over. The cold floor, the scraping of chairs, the rustling of papers, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. As I walked through the door, eyes focused on me like spotlights. Some were curious, others nervous, others feigning indifference. The company owner hadn't arrived yet, but his absence weighed heavily. The air was tense, almost electric. And it was in that silence that I understood something. Waiting is also a weapon. The more time passes, the more fear takes hold of me. I could see the discomfort growing in every gesture. People flipping through papers unnecessarily, crossing their arms, looking at their watches. It was like witnessing an involuntary rehearsal for their own downfall. When he entered, the room seemed to shrink. He had that presence that inspires respect but also hides fatigue. He looked at me a second too long and then at the others. He spoke little, as if he wanted time to resolve what words couldn't. But time was no longer his. I took a deep breath. I opened the folder. The sound of the metal clasp was soft, but it resonated like thunder. I laid the papers on the table. I didn't need to explain much. The signatures, the emails, the manipulated spreadsheets spoke for themselves. With each line that appeared, the room seemed to shrink even further. I saw wide eyes, sweaty palms, expressions trying to compose themselves. And through it all, I remained calm. The contrast was evident. While they trembled, I simply existed. While they tried to justify themselves, I simply listened. While they looked for shortcuts, I remained steadfast. Because I had learned that the power of those who have been humiliated lies precisely in remaining whole when the other falls apart. It was at that moment that I understood something I had perhaps never understood before. This was no longer about revenge. This was about rebalancing the world. I didn't want to see them destroyed. I wanted to see them exposed. I wanted the very echo of their actions to be their judgment. I wanted the laughter of the past to be transformed into the awkward silence of the present. And that's exactly what happened. When I finished speaking, no one dared interrupt me. The air felt thick but clear, as if the truth had invaded the room like an unexpected wind. The company owner looked at the papers, took a deep breath, and uttered a short, firm, and unforgettable sentence. This should never have happened. Those simple words were more powerful than any excuse. They didn't erase the pain, but they sealed the recognition. And I, who had so often been seen as invisible, was now the center of attention, not because of the pain, but because of the courage to face it. There was a long silence after that. That silence that doesn't suffocate, but liberates. And as I looked at each face before me, I realized that all of us in some way had changed. None of us would leave that room the same. And perhaps that's why, when I think about that day, I still long to know what you, who are listening to me now, would do in my place. Because it's easy to talk about justice when it doesn't have your face, your story, your weight. But when it becomes personal, it demands much more than courage. It demands truth. And the truth at that moment was finally on the table. But there was still something to come. Something no one, not even me, could have foreseen. After the meeting ended, the air felt different. People filed out of the room silently, as if they'd forgotten their own language. I stood there for a few seconds, observing the hastily stacked chairs, the papers scattered on the table, the glass of water still half empty. It was curious. That same space that had once made me feel small now seemed smaller, shrunken before what had finally emerged. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to demand respect. The truth, naked and solid, had already done the work for me. But what came next was unexpected. As the situation calmed down, I realized that justice also comes at a price. The reactions were immediate. Some tried to get closer, feigning concern, as if they had never been part of the problem. Others averted their gaze in the hallways, unable to bear their own reflection. The owner of the company, the man who until that day had only seen me as a name on a spreadsheet, began to look at me with a kind of silent respect, the same respect he reserved for those who had survived something he himself would never have the courage to face. Still, there was no satisfaction. What I felt was deeper, heavier. It was as if a door had opened and the rushing wind had disturbed everything. Memories, certainties, even the sense of victory. I spent nights replaying what had happened, trying to understand whether the revelation had freed me or simply shifted my prison. Because when the mask falls, what remains is the harsh reality, and it is never simple. Over the next few days, the office environment became like a distorted mirror. The whispers that had once hurt me were now only distant noises. The sound of printers, the clatter of keyboards, the hurried footsteps in the hallway. Everything seemed to resonate at a different pace. People looked at me warily, as if afraid of breaking something. I saw in every gesture the discomfort of someone forced to see what they had always pretended not to. And in the midst of this new panorama, I discovered something important. The exhibition wasn't the end, but the beginning. It was like shining too much light into an old room. It doesn't just illuminate, it reveals the dust, the cracks, what was hidden in the crevices. I saw for the first time the silent dynamics that sustained that place. The power games, the fragile alliances, the fear disguised as respect. And I understood that the humiliation I suffered wasn't just personal, but part of an entire system that thrived on silence. The contrast was stark. On the one hand, the feeling of freedom. On the other, the weight of responsibility that came with it. 'Cause now everyone was watching me. Some with admiration, others with suspicion. Some even with a kind of bitter envy. The woman who had once been invisible had become a mirror. And not everyone can bear to see themselves reflected in the strength of others. I tried to act naturally, but the tension still vibrated inside me. There were days when I woke up feeling light, believing it had all been worth it. And there were others when the fear returned, whispering questions I couldn't answer. Had I gone too far? Was it possible to start over in the same place where I'd been hurt? My body carried these questions like scars, visible only to those who had experienced something similar. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the window and cast a golden glow over the piles of papers on my desk, I realized the entire office had transformed into a silent stage. I, at the center, felt the stares penetrating the air. It was like being in the middle of a choreography I'd started, but now dancing alone. And oddly enough, there was beauty in that discomfort. Because all true change is like this. It begins with disruption, then restructuring. The owner of the company called me into his office at the end of the day. The light was fresher, the air calmer. He thanked me bluntly, saying that my courage had revealed something everyone knew, but no one dared to say. For a moment, I saw weariness in his eyes. Perhaps regret, perhaps respect. And it was then that I understood that the impact of my actions extended far beyond me. It shook entire structures, people accustomed to silence for convenience. I left the room and walked slowly down the empty hallway. The lights flickered, casting shadows on the floor. I felt like I was walking between two worlds. The past, which still tried to draw me in, and the future, which opened up before me with its uncertainties. The sound of my own footsteps was the only one I could hear. Firm, steady, as if each one marked the rhythm of the new life that was beginning to emerge. As I reached the exit door, I paused for a moment. I looked back and saw the reflection of the office through the glass. The same place that had once crushed me, now small, almost harmless. Outside it was starting to rain, fine and cold, but I took my time. I let the drops fall on me, dissipating the lingering tension in my skin. It was at that moment that I understood that justice doesn't bring immediate peace. It brings clarity, and clarity sometimes hurts more than the wound. But even if it hurts, it's liberating. Because once you see what was hidden, there's no going back. And in some ways, that's what scares the world the most. Seeing a mature black woman with her head held high, walking in the rain, not needing to say anything, simply existing. And as the city flowed around me, I had the strange feeling that the story wasn't over yet. That this ending was just the pause before the next move. And in the silence of the wet street, I understood. Sometimes the true turning point doesn't happen in front of others, but within ourselves, at the exact moment when pain ceases to be a burden and becomes power. In the following days, the rain seemed to persist. Even when the sun came out, there was always moisture in the air, as if the world were breathing more slowly. I walked through the streets with the same care as someone treading on broken glass, attentive to every step, every glance. The silence of the people around me no longer hurt me as it had before. It became a witness. And for the first time, I didn't need to explain anything. The office was still functioning, but something had changed. The sound of the keyboards was the same, the smell of burnt coffee as evening fell. But the energy was different. It was as if everyone was trying to adapt to a new gravity, and I was the axis around which everything revolved. Some colleagues approached with shy smiles, praising my courage. Others kept their distance, with the discomfort of those who fear the reflection that truth projects. I observed everything calmly. I learned that after a storm, there is no such thing as calm. You have to acknowledge the damage. The wet walls, the still slippery floor, the air too heavy to breathe gently. The same thing happened to me. What I experienced gave me strength, but also scars that were still learning to settle within me. Sometimes at night, I would relive the scene of the meeting, as if the sound of the folder being closed still echoed in the walls of my memory. And yet, I felt a strange peace knowing I had done what was necessary. I understood that justice isn't a shout, but a slow, almost imperceptible movement that silently rearranges things. Every glance that now respected me was a piece in its place. Every restrained gesture confirmed that change had begun, even if no one openly mentioned it. The company owner began to act differently. Small, subtle things. A new transparency policy. A meeting with all the women on the team to discuss promotions. A speech about meritocracy that, for the first time, seemed to carry real weight. I watched from afar, with a mixture of skepticism and hope. I knew that true transformation takes time and often only happens when the discomfort is too great to ignore. But no matter how hard I tried to look ahead, something inside me kept hurting. It was like a light turned on too brightly in the darkness. It illuminated what I needed to see, but it also left me uneasy. With each new gesture of respect I received, I remembered the times I'd been denied it. The mind can be cruel sometimes. It insists on returning to the point where we were hurt, even when we're miles away. One afternoon, as the wind blew against the office window, I found myself staring at my own shadow reflected on the wall. It was a steady, constant shadow. For a long time I feared being erased, feared that my actions would leave no trace. But there it was, the silent proof that everything I had experienced had weight, form, and existence. The shadow was the vestige of the light that now reached me. In the hallways, people walked more slowly, measuring their words. It was curious to see how their fear changed. Before, I was the one afraid of being ridiculed, of being eliminated. Now they were the ones afraid of crossing the line and being disrespectful. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for balance. And perhaps that is balance. Seeing others learn, however belatedly, the value of the boundary you've built. Sometimes I still felt doubt whispering, what if it was all for nothing? What if, deep down, nothing really changes? But then I remembered something my mother had told me as a child. Even a seed that falls on broken rock finds a way to grow. And that was exactly how I felt. It didn't matter if the ground was dry. I had sprouted. One night, as I was walking home, the city seemed quieter than usual. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, and each step created small, round, almost hypnotic ripples. I stopped for a moment and looked up. The sky was clear, and a huge yellowish moon hovered over the buildings. I thought about everything I had experienced. The hurtful words, the laughter behind my back, the fear disguised as hierarchy. I also thought about every time I had held back tears so as not to give them the pleasure of watching me fall. And there, under that serene light, I realized that time had shaped me in ways they would never understand. My pain became architecture, my patience steel, my voice now echoed. But even at the height of this awareness, something hung in the air, something that still had no name. The story seemed unwilling to close. As if there were one last page to be written, one last glance to be exchanged, one last response waiting for the right moment to emerge. As I reached the door, I hesitated before entering. I felt something somewhere still moving. It wasn't fear. It was a feeling, the kind of feeling that precedes a new turn. I took a deep breath, grasped the handle, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath with me. Everything was too quiet. And deep down I knew. Silence is always the prelude to something. As I opened the front door, the sound of the latch sounded different, softer, as if something inside me had finally tuned into the world. The air was warm, with the soft scent of coffee forgotten in the thermos. I sat down in the living room chair, the same one that had seen me cry silently so many times, and stared at the clock on the wall. The hand moved slowly, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel rushed. The silence that once frightened me now felt like a refuge. It no longer screamed memories. It simply housed the new. And the new, I realized, wasn't something coming from outside. It was something growing inside me, slowly and steadily, like a root pushing its way through concrete. That night, fear didn't come to visit me. No ghost from the past came knocking. There was just me, my breathing, and the certainty of having survived. The next day, the sun filtered through the gaps in the curtains and flooded the room with a golden light. The floor gleamed, and in that simple glow, I saw a symbol of everything that had changed. The same floor that had once supported my falls now reflected my strength. Sometimes life doesn't change its scenery, but its perspective. And what was once pain suddenly becomes conquered territory. I returned to work, but something essential had changed. People were still watching me, but now with a different gaze. A gaze that mixed respect and curiosity, perhaps even admiration. I didn't need to raise my voice or put on armor. It was enough for me to exist firmly. It was enough for me to never lower my head again. It was enough for me to be. And this realization swept through me like a silent revelation. Dignity, when recovered, has the power to rewrite an entire history without having to erase anything. Late that afternoon, the owner of the company called me back into his office. The atmosphere was different. The words, which had previously been heavy, now flowed cautiously. He thanked me for my courage and said my actions had brought about a real change in the environment. He spoke of respect, of ethics, of the value of those who have always supported the work of others from the shadows. And as he spoke, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about all the women who had been silenced for fear of appearing uncomfortable. Of all the times silence was mistaken for weakness. When I stepped outside, the sky was tinged with red. A dense, almost poetic red, as if the day had bled to give birth to another. I walked to the bus stop with my head held high. The wind played with my gray hair, and I let myself go. That breeze brought something I couldn't yet identify. Perhaps it was lightness, perhaps a new beginning. In the days that followed, I realized that even my body had changed. My stride was firmer, my gaze more serene. I no longer felt that knot in my chest upon waking, nor the need to disappear at the end of each shift. The work was still difficult, the world was still unequal, but something inside me no longer bowed to it. The wound had become a boundary. And those who learn to live on the edge between pain and courage discover a power that no one can take away from them. That night I wrote a letter. Not to him, not to the company, but to myself. I wrote about the day I was humiliated, about the moment I decided to stand up, about the strength I found in silence. I also wrote about fear, but with gratitude, because it was fear that drove me to see what I needed. When I finished, I folded the page and put it in a book on my shelf. Not to forget, but to remember fondly. At that moment, I realized the story wasn't about revenge, but about redemption. About reclaiming my voice, my stance, my faith in myself. And so, today, in telling this, I want to invite you to reflect with me. How many times have you also kept silent so as not to seem out of place? How many times have you pretended not to notice, just to avoid being the focus of tension? If this story moved you in any way, perhaps it's because you too know what it's like to struggle to exist in a space that tries to erase you. And if you know, then leave a trace. A simple gesture. A silent sign that you still believe in the strength of those who start over. Because that's how courage spreads. From glance to glance, from story to story, from life to life. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see the wrinkles that mark my skin like maps of survival. And instead of shame, I feel pride. Each line represents a victory. Each mark reminds me that I was whole, even when they tried to reduce me to dust. I am no longer the woman who stormed into that bathroom crying after being humiliated. I am the woman who emerged from there standing tall, with a clean soul and a steady gaze. I am the woman who discovered that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you impose, with presence, dignity, and truth. And that's what I want to leave here, as a closing and as an invitation. Never doubt the power of standing strong, even when everything around you tries to tear you down. Like this story if it reminded you of your strength. Comment if, in any way, it helped you see something within yourself. And if you want to continue following me through stories like this, subscribe. Not as a spectator, but as part of this silent movement that begins within you and transforms everything on the outside. Because the true happy ending isn't revenge. It's awareness. It's when you understand that the world may try to erase you, but it only takes one act of courage to rekindle everything.